Peter I and the Making of Imperial Russia, Revolution or Consolidation. The major themes and issues I would like to look at are the nature of absolutism, the relationship between Russia and Europe, the question of modernization and westernization, forced modernization and the resistance to it, and the complicated and important question of identity after Peter I's reign, and what does it mean then in terms of the mission of Russia, and the legacies of Peter I's reign. Well, I think first we need to look at Russian absolutism as part of a wider European development. Absolutism became sort of the choice for political rule throughout much of Europe, with few exceptions. The obvious example, of course, is France under Louis XIV, the Sun King, which most European powers attempted to emulate his power, not his style. It's important to consider the advantages and disadvantages of absolutism, why it became the preferred political style and technique of choice during this time, and the advantages of using absolutism for making a more modern, more efficient state and society. Ultimately, absolutism relied on a process of centralizing all resources for the interests of the states, and that state interest typically was about expanding its power, both in terms of resources and through territory. So absolutism can be seen as a process of centralizing centralized royal authority that controls resources and utilizes resources for the state's interests, and typically using war as a very important tool to advance the interests of the state. One of the ultimate ends then of absolutism, both in Russia and throughout Europe, was to create a disciplined and orderly service state. How to make absolutism a reality? And I think the easy equation is to think of one king, one law, one faith. And this slide here kind of gives you a rundown of 5 easy points to become an absolutist ruler. You can sort of plug in these points for most examples, whether it's the French, the Prussian, the Austrian, or the Russian example of absolutism, the need to domesticate nobility or to bring it under the control of the state, whether it's through Versailles or through the table of ranks, as we'll see with Peter the Great, the need to destroy any and all opposition to make sure your state power is enhanced as a ruler, to modernize the army if the army is a tool to advance state interest, then the state wants the best army possible. To make sure that religion is subordinate to the state. If it is about state power, the state must be above all else. The creation of a bureaucracy that supports the needs of the state, to centralize finances, be sure that the most efficient means are being used to gather taxes, conscript soldiers, and to be able to stomp out any opposition. And ultimately, the absolutist ruler wants to make sure that it is a power to be reckoned with and to be respected. And so the need to create empire and to advance the image of being a power, of being an empire, whether it's through territorial gain, through war, or through art. The Baroque period is a good example of this way of sort of enhancing the image of power. This brings us up to Peter I of Russia and how he used absolutism and Western models, Western means, to modernize the state and society. And this raises the whole question of for what purpose? What were his motivations for using these Western models to create a new Russia? And this is going to become one of these big questions in Russian history. Historians argue that he used forced modernization or revolution from above to push Russia westward and create Russia into a developing great European power. And then historians argue of what the cost was of this forced modernization and the consequences. We'll get back to that. Peter the First, by all means, was a monumental figure, both just in his stature, physically, very tall man, but also in terms of history. He just sort of towers over most figures in Russian history. Well, sort of the context of Peter the First. First, he does not develop into Peter the First, this monumental figure, in a vacuum. He does have a specific context, and his father paved the way in many ways for some of his personality traits as well as his policy decisions. So what does Peter the First inherit from his father? Well, it's pretty clear that he developed from his father the idea that any opposition will be crushed. The Moscow Copper Revolt of 1662 is a good example from his father, that the idea that if somebody is going to oppose you, then you will crush that person. And that is an important legacy that we will see in action. The alliance between the Tsar and nobles that was put into effect with the 1649 Code, particularly in terms of giving over the serfs to the nobility. And this alliance will be very important until the end of the imperial rule. Religious splintering, particularly the old believers, is going to be a chronic problem in terms of the rise of opposition that Peter the First inherited. The beginning of Western influences. It was clear that it's not necessarily Western influences that were new, but how much and in what way these Western influences will transform and be part of Russian society. There were unresolved social tensions, peasant revolts, Cossack rebellions, and Peter the First will have his own share of such things. And at this time, the continuation of state expansion in terms of territory, both in the East and the West, and of state expansion in terms of just its absolute power. Peter the First, he has a very difficult time in trying to come to power, as you have seen from your readings. There's a complicated story of these competing rival families for the throne, and ultimately, Peter the First does come to power and is able to begin his transformation of Russia. But before Peter the Great becomes Peter the Great, he's more just Peter the First, and he heads off to the West to discover what is going on in Europe. He is, as from your readings you can tell, is very enamored with Western ways, with how foreigners live in the Moscow foreign quarter, and is eager to see what is going on in the West. So he heads off with his grand embassy in 1697 and begins to learn from the Europeans and makes a splash in European societies, not necessarily in a positive way. He is forced to return home before he was thinking he was going to return back to Russia due to the Streltsy mutiny. And he deals with this mutiny and is a great heavy-handedness, and crushes not only the mutineers, but he also disbands the Streltsy. And this is, I think, a sort of key signal, too, that he's planning on doing something different. He's not going to rely on the elite forces, the Streltsy. He's going to remake the military. His early reforms happened very quickly upon his return. And his initial reforms show that he desires to remake society initially by remaking time, which is pretty dramatic. He declares in his decree in December of 1699 that time will be told in a different way. And the decree on a new calendar essentially tells everyone this is the new way of doing things, and you better celebrate and be happy about it. We are now going to celebrate in the Western way, in a way that is completely different than how we've been celebrating time before this. This very radical transformation. And also another radical transformation was telling people it was time to change how they looked. Not only remaking time, remaking society, but remaking the subject, remaking the man and the woman. Now, you're probably familiar with the phrase that clothes make the man, or clothes make the woman. So the outfit makes the man. And it's clear that Peter the First was determined to remake how people looked, and they would then be remade on how they behaved, how they acted, and hopefully how they thought. And you can notice the differences between what the Muscovite fashion was and compare it to the European, and it's fairly striking. The decree of 1701 declared that the nobility, the townspeople would begin to wear German clothes and ride on German saddles, and effectively transform how they looked, their appearance looked. And building on that was the decree of 1705, Peter's decree on shaving, and the decree on shaving, like the decree of 1701, targets specific people. It's targeting the nobility and the merchants and the military personnel and the Muscovites. It's not going after the clergy. They are exempt from this. And it doesn't force the peasants to shave their beards or dress like Germans, but to enforce this new mentality. The peasants have to pay a beard tax, in essence, and beard taxes become an important source of revenue for the state. What it also does is, by directing these changes onto a specific group of people, the urban elites, it widens this gap between the urban elites and the rural traditionalists. And this gap will continue to widen throughout the centuries. It is a very important aspect of what we'll see as the two Russias that are developing. And the changing of time, of dress and beards, they're not just symbolic. They're more than symbolic. They're more than abstract, but they're a visible declaration of a break with the past and demanding society, or the important people in society, to come along with Peter on this ride. Peter the First, he was motivated primarily, it's argued, by wanting to create Russia as a great European power in terms of its military abilities. And it's argued that Peter the First then went to Europe and studied European methods as a way to be able to compete against the West and to make Russia a competitive military power. He wages long wars, is in fact in wars for almost all of his reign, and he initially does not fare very well in terms of military, but he learns. He's an excellent student, and following the defeat at Narva in 1700 against the Swedish king Charles XII, he aggressively pursues military improvements, and then in the Battle of Poltava, considered one of the greatest battles in history, of June 27, 1709, Peter the First and his troops are able to defeat Charles XII, the Swedish troops, and defeat the great northern power of Sweden. And hence, by defeating Sweden, Russia becomes the new great northern power. And at the same time, this is going on. He has already founded St. Petersburg, has wrestled out what will be called St. Petersburg, and is building St. Petersburg as his so-called window to the West. These achievements have the Senate bestowing the title of Emperor upon Peter in 1721, and Russia is becoming a European power, clearly.